Lebih baik pulang nama daripada gagal di medan tugas. Yakini Tuhan bersama kita. Selamat bertugas, Komando!
To answer you directly, I think it's all three. To answer you in more detail, I think it requires a broader examination of the global political landscape.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome back to the Secret Story podcast. I'm Naura, and today we'll be discussing China and the evolving landscape of global geostrategy. In a world increasingly shaped by conflict, crisis, and competition for influence, one country continues to stand at the center of global attention, and that is China. China's race today is marked not only by economic growth, but also by ideas of change, large-scale investments, and expanding strategic partnerships across regions. The main question is, will China's rise face challenges as it's predicted by many analysts, or are we witnessing a fundamental redrawing of the global balance of power, including in regions surrounding Indonesia? To discuss these issues, we are joined today via Zoom with Michael Robert Dutton, Emeritus Professor of Politics, University of London, and Fellow of the Australian Academy of Social Sciences, and Tavan Dutton as Investment Head and Co-founder Sino-Indonesian New Generation Dialogue, joining us from Denpasar, Bali. Thank you both for being with us today.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, Banara. Lovely to be here.
Okay, before we discuss further to today's theme, Professor Dutton, how would you describe the current political atmosphere in London today?
In London today, I think the current political atmosphere is one of uncertainty, actually. The situation in London, first of all, internally, it has the shadow of a Trump-like figure who's rising in the polls, a prime minister who is deeply unpopular, and internationally tends to be in a position where it's starting to slightly untie itself from aspects of the US ever so slightly.
Okay, Professor Dan. And Mr. Tavan, how are things in Bali at the moment? Is it raining as it is right now in Jakarta, or?
Yes, Bali's always lovely, but unfortunately the weather has been quite erratic lately. So yes, strong winds and strong rain. So yes, please stay safe.
That's true. Okay, Professor Dan, when we looked at today's global landscape, how should we understand China's position in the current world order? I mean, is China mainly a challenger, a balancer, or a new constructor shaping the system itself globally?
To answer you directly, I think it's all three. To answer you in more detail, I think it requires a broader examination of the global political landscape. And to do that, it seems to me we need to recognize that at the minute there is a shift in the tectonic plates of political discourse, I think, taking place. The rise of China vis-a-vis the United States, etc., is becoming a kind of almost like a new Cold War. So that's one part of the story. The other part of the story is what's going on within the broadly the West itself. Yeah. And the emergence of Donald Trump has really radically altered, potentially for the Western alliance, catastrophically, is to radically altered the relationship that places like Europe have with the United States. I mentioned at the beginning that we've got a prime minister who's prevaricating, but there's an ever so slight shift in the relationship with the United States. That's all because of Donald Trump. And Donald Trump effectively is not simply taking over and running the global economy, as it were, but trying to alter that. Now, the United States, from basically the end of the Second World War, set up most of the economic organizations that, in a lot of ways, Donald Trump is now trying to avoid or to trash. The UN, the World Bank, IMF, etc., etc. So we're seeing this sort of basically radical transformation of the economy, of global economic relations taking place, while simultaneously, and in a sense, while at the same time, this emergence of a global Cold War. And within that, it seems to me that we really, you could almost think of this in the way that Deng Xiaoping's foreign policy did earlier on under Mao Zedong, which was the three worlds policy, where you've got the first world, which is that struggle at the top, you've got the intermediaries like Europeans, and then you have the South. I think the key thing that we might want to look at in future and reflect back on is this year's GDP figures for China. Now, you know, you may or may not doubt these figures, but if they've had a growth of 5% in the face of those headwinds from the United States, like ridiculously high tariffs, etc., and the massive uncertainty that created, the almost ending of the of sales of soybeans and things like that, as well as the influence the Americans could see the Chinese had on bond markets, etc., etc. You can actually see that really China was the one that was sort of trying to stand up to the United States. Position in Europe is different. The position in Europe has been one of, as is with the EU being 27 different countries, they've got 27 different views. However, the general position has been one of increasing trepidation at some of the things that Donald Trump's doing. Most recently, of course, Greenland, but before that, Venezuela. So you have Europe that's sort of now, in a sense, looking like the Chinese have done, which is to redirect their trade and to try and, as it were, diversify the trade. Russia, as a sense, is a kind of along with the BRICS, has been a sort of an important organization on the other side that gets less air in Western discourse, but it seems to me it's an important factor. And China, of course, given that it's successfully diverted its trade this year, has shown the way. It's increased its trade with ASEAN, I believe, by something like 8%, Latin America by 6.5%, and Africa by a whopping 18.5%. So with that ability to shift away from the United States, they have, in a sense, really, in a sense, altered the name of the game and pointed to the which this becomes, particularly with their shift to the South-South trade, it becomes an open invitation, it seems to me, for the South once again.
Right. That's a pretty interesting point, Professor Daan. But from your perspective, what might differentiates China's geopolitical approach from these classic great powers as the, as you mentioned, United States or Russia?
I think it differentiates it, well, basically, China initially, particularly with the One Belt, One Road, initiated a very different type of policy to really what the West does. And in the early stages of One Belt and One Road, it was heavily infrastructural, which is not what the West generally tends to do. It tends to be more in area finance, mining, etc. What we've seen is some growth in the Belt and Road, and I think Tavan actually, his sort of more micro examination of Indonesia gives us an idea, more of a blueprint for the way that Belt and Road is moving out of infrastructure toward a more integrated system, which from the Chinese claim anyway is a win-win for both sides. That isn't like the way the West has dealt with the South, and the fact that we've had very little development, the fact that the bizarre thing is, how can Africa be in debt to the West after colonialism, etc.? I mean, I think there is a way in which, there is a need to rejig the world system, but possibly not in the way that Trump's doing. Anyway, Tavan would know better of the detail, and maybe you
Yeah.
could tell us on Indonesia, Tavan.
That's right. I mean, Mr. Tavan, this connects closely to my next question, specifically for Indonesia, about the Belt and Road Initiative. How should it be interpreted for our country?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think my father earlier made some very good points that I want to build upon as well. I think, when we're looking at the global map today, it's very important to move beyond the idea of just a world that is moving from a US-led world order to a China-led one.
Yeah.
What we're actually seeing is a very complex transition towards a multipolar system where power is dispersed, layered, and exercised differently depending on the region. I mean, again, even we're seeing this from figures in the West. If you look at Carney's speech about a rupture taking place right now,
Yeah.
we can really see this again, as was put earlier, a shift in the tectonic plates. So in that context, China is really not just a challenger or just a balancer, but it's increasingly acting as a kind of system builder, you could say. So when we look at the Belt and Road Initiative, I think drawing it closer to Indonesia, I mean, I think it should be understood not merely as an economic project, but as a kind of long-term geostrategic instrument. Essentially, Belt and Road Initiative is really just a kind of synonym for China's outward foreign policy platform. So, there's again, I think one of the a very kind of good way to put it is with the Chinese kind of they call it a chengyu, kind of an expression. So there's the Chinese chengyu that says "feng shan kai lu, yu shui jia qiao," and essentially that means open a road when meeting a mountain and build a bridge when meeting water. So I think this chengyu, or this expression, is very good to describe the kind of pioneering spirit of the BRI. It signals that there's no geographical or political obstacle too great for China's infrastructure goals. And in current modern day diplomacy, it's often used to contrast China's kind of can-do engineering approach with the more risk-averse Western development model. But I mean, I think to really understand the Belt and Road Initiative, it should be understood not as an infrastructure project or policy, but as a sequencing strategy. It begins with physical infrastructure, the ports, the railways, the power plants, which goes back to the expression that I just mentioned, moves on to industrial parks, processing facilities, then into supply chain integration, and finally into financial normalization. So I think when we look at Indonesia, it's now firmly in the phase 2 and 3, which is kind of the industrial and supply chain phase of this process.
That's right.
And I think, that's where Chinese investment will play a critical role in Indonesia's downstreaming strategy, nickel, steel, battery materials, which has also been a consistent policy priority for successive Indonesian governments now. So I think there's a clear synergy there when we look at the Belt and Road and looking at this kind of South-South foreign policy model.
Yeah, as we can see. Yeah, please.
So I just want to add a little bit there. It seems to me that there's two things going on simultaneously. First of all, in terms of China's kind of appeal to South-South, it recognizes any form of government while keeping a form of economic order that resembles the neoliberal order that Trump's trying to trash, which makes it very complicated for middle countries and clearer for the South, I think. For the middle countries, which are so inextricably linked to the United States, the trashing of that kind of global order of globalization for a policy that is still quite unclear and looks much more like a realist, old-fashioned form of trade barriers and protection and it looks like it's going back in time. From a globalist perspective, this is a bit of a disaster. China, in the West, for instance, China really doesn't like the Chinese Communist Party and certainly doesn't like Xi Jinping. But in terms of their economic goals, they're very closely aligned. So we have this contradiction in the as it were, in that free world order I mentioned earlier. We have a contradiction, I think, emerging deeply in Europe as a result of the types of things Tavan's talking about.
Okay, that's really helps to clarify the context we talked about, Professor Dan. And also, as we can see, this Belt and Road Initiative is also progressing in so many countries, right, Mr. Tava? Not only Indonesian, but across the Southeast Asia countries too, like Myanmar and maybe Thailand, Malaysia. And last year also marks the 75th years of diplomatic relations between China and Indonesia. And how should we understand the significance of this milestone, Mr. Tavan, between the two countries?
Yeah, so I mean, I think this goes back to the question you raised earlier, which is what differentiates China's geopolitical approach from other great powers, right? And again, I want to bring in another Chinese phrase, which is 摸着石头过河, 过河. So this is essentially, it means feeling the stones while crossing the river. Now, this is a classic kind of Deng era phrase for pragmatic kind of incremental reform. And this is really what differentiates China from traditional great powers like the US or Russia, and how it projects influence. So, you know, what separates China from traditional great powers is the medium of influence. And I think that really kind of impacts, you know, the 75 years of diplomatic relations between China and Indonesia. So, you know, when China and Indonesia relations were established in 1950, both countries were newly post-colonial states navigating sovereignty, development, and non-alignment. And I think that shared experience was really obviously culminated in the Bandung Conference of 1955, where Indonesia played a host to a new political imagination, one which was centered on equality, non-interference, and strategic autonomy rather than bloc politics. So I think, you know, today the Bandung spirit hasn't disappeared, but it's been kind of translated, you know, which is something that we've both talked about previously a lot. So I think, you know, contemporary engagement, I mean, well, first of all, the Bandung spirit once emphasized an ideological solidarity. Whereas modern Indonesian relations are really focused on a kind of economic capacity building priority. So the emphasis, I guess, has shifted from political symbolism to material outcomes in the way that I see it. But I think that's an important point. But narrowing that down, I think contemporary engagement is really, it's less about rhetoric now. So, you know, less about this kind of post-colonial, you know, similarities, but it's more about, I personally would say contemporary engagement, especially in the Sino-Indonesian relations, is more about like industrial development. It's more about technology and skill transfer, infrastructure connectivity, and long-term growth and resilience. So I think, you know, this is very evident in the structure of economic ties, with China being Indonesia's kind of one of the largest trading partners, bilateral trade exceeding at least 100 billion, you know, annually. And, you know, entering into export commodities like nickel, coal, palm oil, stainless steel, and also, interestingly, traditionally sectors that China has totally not been involved in, which includes the defense industry. You know, now Indonesia is particularly like engaging the Chinese side on defense issues, which is quite unprecedented in history.
Can I just say something there as well, or at least ask Tavan a question? It seems to me that that's all the positive sides, if you like, of the China engagement, and yet we've got a number of factors, particularly on the political and also, I think, on the ethnic front, that, as it were, are potentially destabilizing. The political side of things for Indonesia is not unlike the position Europe is in all sort of way, somewhere caught between the United States and China, and caught between them, not on a level playing field, but one having enormous political power and the other having enormous economic power. So that tension between the political and the economic is one we see throughout the Southeast Asia, all the way down to Australia. Australia's massive dependence on China, while simultaneously trying to hold together an American alliance, looks like a tension that potentially is a break point. So there is that element running through the whole of Southeast Asia, and probably the fact that the AUKUS arrangement, which basically sees nuclear-powered ships sitting on the South China Sea, protecting Southeast Asia from Chinese incursions, while there are still border region disputes with places like the Philippines, etc., and Vietnam, etc. Everybody, there are disputes there. This is not necessarily going to be plain sailing. That seems to be a major tension between the political level alliances and the economic kind of reality, if you like.
Yeah,
That's right.
yeah. I mean, I would totally agree with that. You know, and I think it's an important point that should be worth mentioning, because I mean, in my career, I've dealt a lot with Chinese companies, Chinese investors,
Sure.
and even a Chinese investor that is totally ignorant of Indonesia,
Hmm.
I'm quite surprised to find that they're quite aware of the anti-Chinese history in Indonesia, even
I
to this
see.
day.
Yep.
So I think that's kind of quite an interesting point where, a lot of Chinese that I've met when I've, introduced kind of investment opportunities that exist in Indonesia, one of the concerns that it has raised is actually that anti-Chinese history, whether we're talking about 65 or 98 or
That's true.
anywhere in between. So, you know, um, no, I totally agree that it's different in the West as it is to Southeast Asia, but there is this tension between the economic agenda and the political agenda.
Hmm.
However, I think, generally speaking, I think there is, unlike, let's say, unlike America specifically, I think there is a broader recognition in Beijing that Indonesia is indeed a middle power with agenda
Yep.
setting capacity. So not only nationally, but regionally. So
Mm.
Indonesia's its weight within ASEAN, its role as a maritime hub, its control over critical resources like nickel, especially
Yeah.
in the age of EV, all give Indonesia kind of structural leverage that China can't ignore. So
Hmm.
in practice, what this means is that China engages Indonesia not simply as a recipient of capital only, but as a co-shaper of regional economic architecture. From supply chains to
That's right.
infrastructure corridors. Southeast Asia and Indonesia in particular is no longer viewed as a peripheral theater of great power competition, but
Yeah.
but as a power center in its own right within an increasingly multipolar world.
That's right. Okay, Mr. Tavan. Now, I would like to shift slightly to military context. I mean, as Mr. Tavan mentioned earlier too, right, about defense cooperation. Professor Dan, why are Indo-Pacific maritime routes, particularly the South China Sea, is so vital to China's national interests?
It's well, all I can say is it's not called the South China Sea for no reason. It's like a central export zone. It needs to, for the Chinese, there's a certain sense that those corridors need to be operative in order for China to survive.
Right.
I think there's more going on than simply it looking after its economic interests with the, I suppose you're talking about the 9 or 10 dot
Right.
kind of, it seems to me there's more going on there. And it really, I think that border, in a sense, it has been historically contested. I think, for instance, Taiwan, the Republic of China, as it used to be known, that similarly claims the same sort of area. So it's a traditional Chinese claim rather than one that's politically affixed to the Chinese Communist Party.
That's right.
It's that fixing of it to that name of the People's Republic of China that has caused this massive global concern, not just regional concern. But for China, in a sense, it has that sort of historic root, but not, I suspect, as deeply as the roots it has with Taiwan,
Right.
where Taiwan is seen as an inalienable part of the Chinese state. I think those borders are sort of less significant, but nevertheless still kind of important.
That's right.
Yeah,
Okay.
look, I want to add to that as well. I mean, when you look at the Malacca Straits, for instance, and China, like there's over 60% of China's oil imports
Yeah.
via the Malacca Strait. Over around 40, I think about 40% of China's LNG imports go through the Malacca Strait. I mean, it's a key kind of chokehold for China's economy, right? So, I mean, China's interest in the South China Sea, it's often framed as a territorial or nationalist issue at its core, but like fundamentally, it's an economic and systemic issue. China is the world's
Okay.
largest trading nation, the largest energy importer. As I mentioned those figures earlier. So I mean the South China Sea itself carries around 30% of global maritime kind of trade by
Right.
value. So from all around the world. From Beijing's perspective, I think maritime security is therefore not optional; it is existential. And I think this explains why China's kind of naval modernization, coast guard expansion, port diplomacy, as it's been called, and offshore energy strategy, they converge so tightly in this region. The objective is not to block or control trade, but to ensure that
Right.
no external power can credibly threaten China's access to it.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that's an important, when and Indonesia's role within this context is often underestimated, but it's
Yeah.
fundamentally unique. Indonesia is not a claimant state to the South China Sea dispute. yet it sits astride the maritime choke points that connect the Indian and Pacific Ocean. So, the Natuna Island issue is obviously such a huge issue,
That's
and it
right.
lies directly at the intersection of the shipping lanes with energy potential, it makes Indonesia a maritime gatekeeper rather than a territorial rival. And importantly, from the Indonesian side, the government has framed this not as a sovereignty dispute. I mean, President Prabowo even recognized that there was a shared border, which threw the kind of diplomatic world into some chaos at the time.
Yeah.
But so it was again not a diplomatic, not a territorial dispute, but a exclusive economic zone and resource management issue, which
Yeah.
I think really decisively shifts the legal and diplomatic terrain on that question.
That's right. But
Wouldn't you think that there's kind of multiple things going on simultaneously? Like, for instance, it seems to me that around the question of Taiwan, for instance, that's a different question to the South China Sea question, right?
Absolutely,
And
yeah.
each of those kind of disputes within the South China Sea generally shift with the political terrain. For instance, the shift to Marcos in the Philippines changed the nature of that dispute to some extent, right? So we're seeing the way in which, and I think you're absolutely right about the key thing is it's the South China Sea. It is an existential question for China,
Right.
which is, I suppose, what I was trying to get at earlier when it's not just about economics, it's an existential question.
that's right. I mean, the South China Sea and the Natuna Seas. I think this is a clearly complex and sensitive issues. I mean, along the years. I mean, up until now, I guess. But how do you assess the current state of defense cooperation, Mr. Tavan, between Indonesia and China today?
A bit more of a civilian question, I guess, again about the South China Sea, but
Yeah.
I think the idea of the Natuna Island issue, right, which essentially has often been framed in, especially in Western media, as a kind of military buildup, a kind of head-to-head issue, but
Right.
what's being proposed essentially in this context, the idea of joint development, which is essentially what the Chinese are proposing for offshore exploration, is often misunderstood, in my opinion. It's not a concession of sovereignty nor a sign of weakness. In fact, I think it mirrors how China itself built its offshore energy capabilities during the post-reform era. Like in the 1980s and 1990s, Chinese state firms, particularly CNOOC, CNOOC, they
Okay.
entered into production sharing and joint development agreements with Western oil companies such as Chevron, Exxon, BP, Shell, in areas like the Pearl River Mouth Basin and Bohai Bay. So, these arrangements explicitly incorporated technology transfer, operational training, and shared risk, which
Okay.
allowed China to essentially leapfrog technical constraints while retaining ultimate resource ownership. So, I think joint development in that sense, it's not about dependency, but it's about capability accumulation under controlled conditions.
Right.
So I think, that also goes to defense as well, right? When we look at something like defense, Indonesia is not choosing sides. It's essentially maximizing its options, is the
Yep.
way that I see it. It's encouraging competition amongst suppliers. It's preserving its strategic autonomy, and it's buying equipment. Buying equipment is not the same as buying into an alliance,
Yeah.
which is, again, a very unlike the American way. So, Indonesia explored the KFX with Koreans. They, in terms of the jet, if we're looking at jet fighters, they explored the KFX program with Koreans that didn't work out. But most recently, they decided to pursue both, Rafale from France and also
Yeah.
the Kaan from Turkey. And as we know, the much talked about J10 purchase of, I think, about nine J10 models, and even joint patrols with Bakamla, which is
That's right.
the border patrol, right, in Indonesia,
Yeah.
the Customs border patrol. So I think the defensive orientation is also reinforced by how China structures its exports, its relationships, and I think again it goes back to that Deng Xiaoping era of feeling the stones to cross the river. It's a flexible approach. It's a kind of dynamic approach, and at its core, I think China's modernization still reflects a kind of regional,
Yeah.
contingency-driven defense logic rather than an overt quest for global military dominance.
Right.
Again, you got the platforms such as the J10 multi-role fighter, the coastal defense missile systems, and the second-hand People's Liberation Army Navy vessels. They're all optimized for airspace denial, maritime control, and rapid
Uh,
regional response,
yeah.
not for long-range expeditionary warfare. Again, China's never had an overseas war. I mean, they
Yeah,
have had, yes, 1979, they had a border skirmish with Vietnam, but again, they haven't had the kind of America going into Iraq or
that's right.
Afghanistan or
Mm,
Venezuela approach. So I think again the in the Indonesian case, I think it's rather than alliance building on Western terms, I think this approach is consistent with a doctrine that's focused on controlled diffusion of power, optimizing options, I would say.
okay, that's very interesting point too, Mr. Tovan, which brings us to another important aspect. Professor Dunn, China is often associated with the concept of gray zone strategy. Now, how does this strategy work in practice, especially in Southeast Asian maritime areas?
I think maybe Taman would be better off answering that question.
Okay, maybe Mr. Tovan?
Sure. So, I mean, again, I think it certainly is the case. Again, it goes back to that Chinese kind of ethos of crossing the river by
Yeah.
feeling the stones, flexibility, and again, so China, again, when we look at it, again, going back to like the military footprint, China's overseas military footprint, right? So, like, I think it's China frames these engagements explicitly as kind of non-aligned, non-bloc based cooperation. So
Yeah,
again, unlike NATO-style security arrangements, there are no mutual defense obligations, even compared to the Russians with the CSTO, which
okay.
its efficacy is questionable at best. But when the Chinese do these kind of defense contracts or training, joint training programs, unlike NATO-style security arrangements, no defense obligations, no basing rights, no permanent force presence. Instead,
Yeah.
China offers speed, affordability, financing flexibility, and incremental capability, with knowledge and technology transfer. So this appeals to emerging markets like Indonesia that seek this strategic autonomy and diversification away from Western dependency, which has been the go-to status quo model so far. So again, I think the idea of China being in a gray zone, again, it's not necessarily applicable to the idea of China replicating US-style global dominance. It's more
Okay.
about shaping a security environment through capability interdependence, especially in
Yeah.
the multipolar Indo-Pacific.
Yeah.
Again, by enabling partners to defend their own airspaces and coastlines while remaining dependent still on Chinese supply chains, upgrades, and political goodwill, of course, which is where the Taiwan issue probably comes into play. So, essentially, China projects its influence without formal alliances and power without overt militarization. Yet, I mean, a good way to put it is maybe China will approach with a carrot first, in a way that Donald
Okay.
Trump will approach with a very big stick.
Right. Okay. So basically, if I understand correctly,
Sorry, can
Mr.
I
Tovan.
but I think what Taman's pointed to here is the way in which the BRI is not just an economic
Yeah.
form. It's also a form of soft power. If one kind of goes head to head with China's soft power, particularly in the West, I think in South-South relations, it's much more successful because of that. In the West, it's less successful because soft power takes a different form. But I think that melding of soft power with economic power is a
Right.
way in which that's why you get the carrot before any stick. And the stick has generally been exclusion from the carrot. It can get much harder, and there are certain kind of no-go zones, and there are certain ways of, I think, operating that are different. The Spanish have a notion of translator traitor, and I think when it comes to international relations, the way in which Western powers operate and the way in which China and non-Western powers operate is quite different. And I think there's miscommunication there, which I think BRI works better in the South than it does in that middling range of power.
Okay. Now,
Yeah. So, I mean, ultimately, just to add to that, I mean, ultimately, I think China's modernization reflects, I mean, I guess you could say a doctrine that's been described as defensive at home, influential abroad. And what that means, I guess, is expanding strategic reach under the language of peace, development, and South-South cooperation. So, in this context, Southeast Asia and Indonesia in particular is not treated as a subordinate theater or a junior partner, but as a strategic center of gravity in an emerging multipolar order.
Okay. Now, speaking of Indonesia as a partner, Mr. Tovan, how resilient is Indonesia's free and active foreign policy? In this case, maybe it's a bit off the topic, facing the rivalry between China and United States. What can you say about?
Yeah, no, I think that's an important question. And, right now is a very precarious time for all governments, especially for Indonesia, which Indonesia is, and I mean, the current administration, they're very much trying to stick to the non-aligned middle ground path. But, ultimately when tensions get too high and there is a kind of boiling point, there's going to be an expectation by both parties to kind of pick a side on certain issues, at least. So I think, I think the Indonesian government has to be very careful not to go too far to either appease or to annoy either side. And I think, what this really requires is strong information circulation that reaches the very top pillars of power in Indonesia at the moment. So, I think, again, Indonesia has a great opportunity, but it's also in a very precarious and dangerous position where it could, again, do too much to one side and then try and overcompensate and leave both parties upset, both parties being the US and China, right? So, look, the most important takeaway is this. Southeast Asia is no longer a passive arena in the great power competition. And it shouldn't act like one. I think the Indonesian government should be firm on certain issues and should kind of, really argue their point. Again, Indonesia is a power center in its own right, and it should act like it. In particular, Indonesia, it controls critical minerals. It anchors ASEAN diplomacy. It sits on top of vital maritime checkpoints, which we've been over, and it represents one of the world's largest emerging markets. Now, I think, both China and America realize this reality, and I think Indonesia should adapt accordingly and kind of take on the role that it is in a way that's, effective. And again, I think that relies on a very strong information loop going to the top echelons of political power in Indonesia. But, again, to summarize, in a multipolar world, power does not only belong to those who dominate militarily. It belongs to those who cannot be bypassed. And Indonesia cannot be bypassed.
Right. So it's safe to say that I think Indonesia still stand in the middle as a middle-powered country, we don't pick sides, between maybe the United States or China. I think it's safe to say that Indonesia is still balancing their position, right?
And in many ways, that's still the same position. In a sense, it's a different formulation of a similar sort of ethos that held together the non-aligned world.
Right. Okay.
Which goes back to Bandung, and it goes back. And it seems to me that that's essentially again a modernized. It just like that non-alignment idea has been modernized, so too in China itself. I think that idea of a multipolar world is really, in a sense, an extension of the same logic that came back from 1955. So you have had a certain sort of continuity with change. It's not really a repetition, but because there's so much difference, but still there's a change there. The other thing that I should mention is that the emergence of, and again, this is more like kind of internal gossip. There is a real perception, I think, in China that there was a decision made that they should harden their stance towards the West. We noticed up until Hu Jintao, the politics were kind of much more accommodating of Western demands or Western insistences. I think Deng Xiaoping really does flag a new approach, and that approach is one which says you do not need a Western style representative democracy on top of a thriving economy, but there are other ways of governance. And in a way, for the South in particular, that is a welcome story. For the Europeans, it's a very unwelcome story. And for the Americans, it's a challenge.
Okay, but looking forward, Professor Dutton, do you expect global power shifts or maybe moves to accelerate under China's influence?
I think that a new Cold War seems to be inevitable, in my opinion. And I think that that's evidenced by the fact that as early as the Obamas tilt to the Asia, we were already seeing growing military concerns and indeed growing concerns about who's hegemonic from the Americans. So the Obama regime were running a particular agenda that was more about global justice, which aligned with global trade, and global trade would advance global justice, which would allow for the development. It's almost like a 1950s modernization theory revamped for the 2000s, which is that it'll be more like us, as it were. I think that global justice agenda that really was dominant in the Obama-Biden era gave way to a very much more mercantile, much more sort of not even contractual, just more business and aggressive form of with Donald Trump. But irrespective of what happens, China looms as the enemy. And I don't think that's going to shift anytime soon. And I don't think there's necessarily going to be a hot war, but the global war will change. The difference, however, is in the old Cold War, we had a thing called Comecon, which was an economic alliance of Eastern European countries with the Soviet Union, based upon a planned model of economic development. Now what we've got is the challenge coming from within, because economically, China is the factory of the world. So we have a much more difficult challenge from this because the lines are no longer clear. They're blurred.
That's right, they're blurred. That's the point. Okay, but Mr. Tavan, how do you see Indonesia-China relations evolving among these changes in the global order up till today?
Yeah, well, I mean, I completely agree with the previous comments. I mean, we're seeing a world that's changing now, that's becoming a lot more transactional, but a lot more development driven, and not necessarily the alliances are not ideological per se now. So, and I think this goes back to what separates China from traditional great powers, and that, again, is the medium of influence. If you look at the United States, for instance, they historically project power through formal military alliances, security guarantees, and values-based diplomacy, which can often take the form of coercion through aids and grants. You've got the Russians who project power through their historical post-Soviet bloc ties, hard security instruments, again, like the CSTO. Whereas, China, I think, projects power primarily through economic integration, and it prioritizes trade flows, infrastructure, long-term investment, and both elite to elite, high-level channels, but also grassroots-based kind of backdoor channels, which all for the aim of project durability, essentially. So again, it does not demand ideological alignment. I mean, if China invests in something, it's not like when USAID invests in something. When USAID invests in something, it's usually that's aligned ideologically with an American sensibility. When China will invest in something, it does not demand ideological alignment. China works with democracies, it works with hybrid systems, it works with authoritarian states alike. What it seeks is predictability, scale, and continuity. And I think this pragmatism explains why China's engagement with Indonesia remains stable across multiple political transitions, from President Jokowi's development-centric administration to President Prabowo's more nationalist and strategic posturing on the international stage. Essentially, the principle is simple and it's consistent. Keep projects moving, keep finances flowing, and keep channels open, both through formal diplomacy and informal elite networks. And I think the Sino-Indonesian relationship will basically, as far as I can see, will maintain this course as long as, and this is something that I've kind of seen myself, as long as the host country, in this case Indonesia, or it could be anywhere, but as long as the host country has the appropriate mechanisms to be able to absorb Chinese capital and provide the kind of terms and conditions that Chinese capital requires, which are things like repayment guarantees or clear collateral provision, things like that. So, I mean, it really depends. I mean, Indonesia has all the cards as much as China has all the cards. It can be a fruitful relationship, as long as I think the Indonesian government is very cautious, careful, and
Yeah.
considerate about how it goes ahead with this relationship. Because again, I mean, the opportunity to have a very kind of productive win-win relationship is there, but if the Indonesian government, again, there's only so much that they can bank on the leverage they have being the maritime chokehold,
Yeah.
having access to minerals. If there's any kind of, blunders on the geopolitical kind of platform, I think, the relationship could maybe not sour. I don't think. I don't think we're going to go to a kind of new order style
Yeah.
freezing of relationships. But I think Indonesia just won't benefit in a way that it could potentially.
Yeah, but as far as I can see, maybe from Indonesia's perspective, this creates both opportunity and challenges also, right? From this,
The challenge is, treading ground where two elephants go, I mean, and not getting stomped on by either one,
Yeah.
really. I think
That's right.
that's the real challenge. And not only that, but it's about, not kind of non-alignment doesn't necessarily mean squeezing as much as you can from both sides either, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think you can have a productive relationship with both parties. But as long as there are clear boundaries, as long as, again, strategic autonomy is created, but in a way that's productive rather than extortionate.
okay. This maybe one final question from me as a closing questions for both of you. So, Professor Dutton, what are your hopes for today's global situation?
Personally, I think the key question is the elephant in the room: climate change. I think in a way the disaster of contemporary politics lies in the fact that climate change requires a global response, and we seem to be getting more and more fragmented, and more the fragmentation of views and values, the emergence of a president in the United States who doesn't believe in climate change. Drill, baby, drill, it seems to be the answer. And at the minute, at least until the midterms, has a clear run to do pretty much what he seems to think is important. There's no challenge either from Congress or from the Supreme Court, because that's pretty much aligned with Republicans. So until the midterms, at least, we've got a president who doesn't believe in that. And we've got a climate crisis that grows worse and worse. But it seems to me, therefore, we should be thinking in those global terms and thinking less in terms of these rather in they may be looked at in hindsight as rather minuscule little battles. So my main concern would be about that, rather than necessarily all the goings on the ground, which are really, in a sense, just examples of how we're feeling.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Professor Dutton. And from you, Mr. Tavan, what are your hopes for today's global situation?
Well, I mean, I'll focus it just on, on our region, Ms. Naura. Again, asking where all this leads. We're moving toward a world where Indonesia refuses to be a spectator in great power great power politics. So I think by leveraging minerals, geography, I think there's a way that Indonesia can tell both Washington and Beijing, you cannot bypass us. And I think the hope for 2026 isn't a world without competition. I mean, that's inevitable.
Okay.
But it's a world where competition, I hope, will be governed by mutual necessity rather than competitions. And again, as the Chinese expression goes, when we meet a mountain, we open a road. Today, the mountain is global fragmentation. And the road is a more resilient, multipolar Indonesia that is finally taking its seat at the head of the table. And that's what I hope to see personally.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Tavan. And thank you for Professor Dutton and Mr. Tavan for sharing insights with us. And we really appreciate your perspective and your presence today here with our podcast. And that brings us to the end of today's episode, where today's discussion reminds us that global geopolitics is constantly evolving, and China's role within it continues to shape conversations around power, strategy, and future of the international order. Okay, friends, thank you for listening to the Secret Story podcast. I'm Naura. Until next time, thank you for being part of this conversation. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and good afternoon.
Lebih baik pulang lama daripada gagal di medan tugas. Yakini Tuhan bersama kita.